Hi and welcome back to the giant world of tiny things. My name is Maximilian and today I'm going to show you how I created this photograph. And as you can tell just by looking at this image, this is not a scene that you just stumble across out in the woods on a macro walk when you happen to carry a camera and you snap a shot. It's actually an image that I pre-visualized and then executed in a controlled studio environment after setting it up carefully. And that obviously raises the question, how did I get the butterfly to pose for me? And the answer is quite simple, it wasn't a live model. And that's something where I quickly want to say a couple words to, because there's a bit of ethics involved, and I think that's an important aspect of macro photography and generally photography whenever there are animals or insects involved. Now obviously I didn't kill the butterfly and I didn't purchase it, and that's something that I want to make clear, because I don't think that's the right way to go about macro photography, and I don't want you guys to feel encouraged to do it either. I believe that macro photography is about being at peace with nature and being respectful towards nature and other beings. And so it's important for me that you guys know that I actually found this butterfly when it was still alive and it couldn't fly very well, and I found it fairly close to a place where I used to live and was hopping more through the field than it was actually flying. It was just beating its wings, but it wasn't getting anywhere, and I could tell it wouldn't be able to just find enough food sources, nor would it be able to flee from predators. So I got it to crawl onto my pond and I carried it into our backyard, where I made a little makeshift habitat for the butterfly with some wildflowers and mosses, and I fed it honey until it eventually deceased. And that's how I ended up having this specimen. And if you're looking to gather specimen like that for your macro photography, the number one source obviously is nature. You will be able to find deceased insects if you just keep your eyes open. Over the last couple of years I found 2 or 3 dragonflies, a bunch of butterflies, and even more bumblebees and bees, which is another really sad topic, but yeah, that's how it is. Unfortunately, we're using too many pesticides and that's the result of it. But I don't think there's anything wrong with ethically sourced specimen and photographing them. Another great source and another ethical source for specimen, and especially butterflies, are butterfly conservatories, because they usually collect their dead specimen and then sell or donate them to schools and museums and artists like you and I. Now that we've got the ethical aspect of this image out of the way, let's move over to the creative side and discuss how we can stage and execute this image. So the first question is, what do we need for this image? And for this image I used a repurposed notebook as a screen light that I used to backlight my backdrop, which I got printed on acetone foil, and that just creates a very evenly and nicely lit background that provides you with a lot of creative flexibility, as you can print any image that you would like to use as a backdrop, and it adds a bit of depth to your image without having actual really hard shadows or specular highlights, unless obviously your background image has those areas already in it. The image that I chose for this shoot is one that I found on Pexels.com, and it's pretty much exactly what I've been looking for. I typed in the keywords Enchanted forest and I was looking for a bluish kind of image which had a color palette that would complement the orange and brown tones of this little butterfly that we're going to photograph today. And this is the image that I found, and I'm really happy that I found it, and I'm always impressed with the range of images and their quality on Pexels.com, which is a website for royalty-free images. And no, I'm not sponsored or I don't have any relationship with them at all. I just think they're fantastic and worth knowing about. Also, a big thanks goes out to Pixabay for providing the background image that I downloaded. Once I downloaded the image, I figured out that it's just a little too small. It was too narrow and not tall enough for the scale that I had in mind. So I loaded it into Adobe Photoshop and I used the content aware fill function to just make the image a little bit larger and extend its height. And that's just a great way to increase your image size or your backdrop size if you're looking to do projects like this. Now we're going going to stick that acetone print right onto our backlight. I used a repurposed notebook for my backlight, but you can use any soft and even light source for this purpose. May that be an actual softbox or just an LED light or two with a piece of parchment paper or tracing paper as a diffusion layer, or even a computer screen with an empty Word document is going to work just fine for this purpose, because all we need is a soft and even flat light source. And by just sticking that acetone print onto that light source, you can already see how it's coming alive and how much different it's looking already. Next, I decided to add a little bit more depth to my image by placing this set of decorative mushrooms in front of my backdrop, and I guess you could still consider them the background, but it's just an additional layer that makes the image appear a little bit more dimensional and more realistic, even though I'm not going for a realistic feel with this image, but I still don't want it to appear too flat, and so those mushrooms did a great job at just achieving that. And I picked them up at the dollar store I think a couple years ago in the fall time, and I knew at some point I'd have a creative use for those mushrooms. And yeah, I always like gathering creative ingredients like these when I come across them, especially when they're cheap. And if your mind works somewhat like mine does, pick up creative ingredients when you find them, because then you have stuff to stage in the winter time or during lockdowns or whatever the world might throw at you. Now, to hold these mushrooms in place, I used an alligator clip of a third hand tool. Actually, the third hand tool that I'm using provides 6 extra hands, and it's sold on eBay as a soldering station, and it's really useful. So yeah, once again, if you like staging creative macro shots or close-up shots inside, this might be something you want to consider getting, because it makes your life so much easier. Now let's talk about our actual subject, the butterfly sitting on that mystical winding branch that I placed it on. And as you can see, it's doing a pretty darn good job at holding onto that branch. And the reason for that is that I used some water solvent adhesive to temporarily glue it into place. And the adhesive I used is just sugar water, because it's easy to use, easy to mix, everybody has the ingredients. And once you're done your shoot, it's just as easy to undo. Simply by spraying a bit of water onto the connection, you can undo it without actually damaging your subjects. And to hold my subject in place, I used alligator clips once again, because they just do a fantastic job at keeping your hands free during a macro shoot. The branch that I used to place the butterfly on is another subject that I found out in nature during one of my many macro walks. Let's see if I can focus the camera on it. There we go. You can see it's got all these little winding spirals and a very interesting shape to it, and I just figured that one day I would have use for it in a creative macro shoot, and now the time has come, and I use all these little winding ways to hold in place water beads, also known as ore beads, that look like this once you soak them in water. And those are the refracting spheres that you saw in my final image, and that really was the hardest part of this whole composition, to place those spheres on those little winding curves and really get them to stay on where I needed them to be. But once they were in place, the image looked pretty fantastic, and was time to actually photograph the scene. Now let's talk about the equipment that I used to photograph it. For my camera I used the 6D Mark II, which is my go-to camera for most projects, unless I need a crop factor, but in this case I obviously didn't. I didn't even need a macro lens, because the scale that I decided on was way larger than the 1:1 macro scale, and so I used my 28 to 135mm EF lens with one 20mm extension tube, just to enable the close focusing on that lens. Now for lighting, I obviously used the backlight in the background, but I also used a couple speed lights, one with a diffuser at 1/8 of its power to illuminate the butterfly in the foreground and just to make it stand out. And then I added an additional off-camera speed light off to the other side of the scene and shooting past the subject, and I used it to create those golden specular highlights that you can see floating through the air in my image. And those highlights were nothing but some simple golden glitter powder from the craft store, and I just sprinkled some of it across the foreground while triggering my camera shutter with an intervalometer. And I think it turned out really nicely. I wasn't after any super fancy bokeh bubbles, I just wanted to add a bit of a mystical, magical atmosphere to the image and add some complementary warm colors to the dominant blues of the frame, and I think it came together really nicely. Now that's pretty much the whole video already, how I created the image and what you need to stage an image of this kind yourself. But before we wrap it up, let's quickly talk about my camera settings. The aperture was set to f14, which is just small enough of an f value to avoid diffraction softening and maintain an ideal image quality, whilst also providing enough depth of field to keep the background somewhat in focus and make sure that it's not blurred out, since we put so much work into it and as it's such an important component of our image. My shutter speed was set to 1/100th of a second, as that provided the perfect balance between the backlight and my flash exposure in the foreground, and I took a few test shots before I got there and finalized my settings, and therefore I've also been able to maintain my base ISO of 100, which just provides the best image quality possible. The flash head that was directed onto the subject was set to 1/8 of its power, and the other flash head that I used to create the specular highlights in the foreground was set to 1/64th of its power. And that's pretty much all my settings. I think we got everything covered now. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video and if you like the outcome, the image on screen right now, please leave me a thumbs up and consider subscribing to this channel to not miss future videos, and also to support my work. It really means a lot to me. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time with another video. Until then, stay creative, keep shooting, and have a good time. Bye.